being able to have those robust discussions is really key in my book. And if a business culture doesn't allow for those robust conversations, then you're not necessarily going to get the right outcome.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hey, Jack here. Today we are going to discuss ERP organizational change implementation with a colleague and a longtime practitioner. We will discuss ERP success, ERP implementation project management, the role of corporate culture, common challenges, learning and development, and more. All of us here at the ERP OCJ hope you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human element components of ERP organizational change. In this episode, we will discuss ERP success, practitioner pointers, with David Ogilvie. David is a business strategy consultant, independent ERP expert, supply chain specialist, author, speaker, and owner of David Ogilvie Consulting. Joining us from Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack. It's great to be here.
You're very welcome, and it's a pleasure, and we're really looking forward to this conversation, sharing some of your insight. But before we get started, David, can you further introduce yourself to our listeners?
Certainly. Jack, I come from a slightly different background to many of my competitors and others in the industry, in that my roots actually go back to working in a family business. So I was working with my dad and my mum in their business from about the age of 7. And so I guess I've got a slightly different slant to many of the others around the traps, in that I've been a business owner and had to sit in the seat that many of my clients currently are sitting in. So I think that sort of gives me a key differentiator in many ways. But when I left the family business, I ended up starting and selling a couple of technology businesses. And on the sales trip to one of those businesses, I ran into an old university mate of mine. And over a glass of, or too many red wines and dinner, he said, I'd like to get into business with you. And I'm going, really? Doing what? And he said, consulting. And I've gone, I don't know anything about consulting. I'm a businessman. Anyway, cut a long story short, he said to me, you know more than you think you do. He and I went into business. Like many partnerships, unfortunately, it didn't work. So I lost a business partner and a friend. But at that time, I then went out on my own. So I've been doing this since 1998.
Interesting. And I know you bring great experience, David. I know your background well. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing your insights.
Thank you, Jack.
Well, David, the first question, and I really like to ask my fellow friends and practitioners this question because it seems like a straightforward question, but some of the responses are interesting and great conversation points. But how would you define ERP?
ERP is the software that helps run a business. Now, it is technology piece that is wholly dependent on human behavior to make it work properly.
That's a great definition. So based on that, David, suppose you're leading a kickoff meeting for an organization that's just starting an ERP implementation. How would you define and describe for them success then in terms of an ERP organizational change effort?
Great question. I believe that success starts with no business interruption at go live. I think you and I have both seen many organizations have major issues at the cutover piece. So, it finishes with the business outcomes being significantly improved to what was in place before the project started. The work starts with correctly identifying the culture of the business within which that you've got to work. Each business's culture is different and requires different tools and techniques to be used in order to deliver those improvements. However, one of the consistent points between them all is accountability. Mm-hmm. If the software vendor and the client both have a culture of accountability, then success is attainable, in an industry that has an horrendous failure rate.
And speaking of that, David, let me ask you about that point. How would you describe your general understanding of ERP implementation success rates in the field or based on your own work or anecdotal evidence of others or your research? Just in general, what's that look like?
Well, I find many implementations classified as being successful because they've actually gone live, when in fact the business is often not better off. And so in my humble opinion, my mission is to make a dramatic dent in those amongst my client base.
Yeah.
There's a lot of numbers being thrown around about, between 70 and 80, 85% of ERP implementations failing to deliver in some form or another. So like all of us, I've had projects that didn't deliver the outcome that was desired. But the good news is we've all learned what the causes of those failures are over time. In many reasons, that's why I wrote my book, The 14 Deadly Sins of ERP Implementation, to highlight the most common sources of these issues so that others could learn from those mistakes and not fall into them themselves.
And by the way, to our listeners, David's book link will be included in our show notes. So, David, from your experience implementing ERP, what would you say are the most critical aspects of ERP implementation project management?
So while the skills and experience of a project manager are important, I think there are three aspects that will really influence the result. And they are the culture and then the capability on both sides of the fence, that is the software vendor and the client. The culture requires the project to be completely aligned with the corporate strategy. And I find that this is often missing. So part of my work with clients is to actually run strategy sessions to help them get clarity around what the business is going to look like, smell like, taste like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It also requires that the business really understands their business requirements. I am surprised by how often I go into these projects, and when we sort of doing design sessions and business requirement capturing type sessions, we get different views from different parts of the business about what's required. Many executives really don't agree or understand what's going on in the business, and their view of what the shop floor people are doing is completely different from what's actually happening on the floor. So that whole culture about understanding requirements is really important.
Yeah.
Likewise, a culture of open communication, being able to have those robust discussions is really key in my book. And if a business culture doesn't allow for those robust conversations, then you're not necessarily going to get the right outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I know, David, you talk about some of this in your book. And again, for our listeners, that's the 14 Deadly Sins of ERP Implementation. But David, why do you think that many ERP projects fail to deliver on expectations then? There's obviously been countless papers written highlighting all sorts of reasons for ERP failure. And obviously your book talks about that with the 14 Deadly Sins. But what would you say are maybe a couple of the primary reasons that they fail to deliver on expectations?
I think fundamentally, we as an industry don't learn from the lessons of the past. And I think part of the cause for that is that executives rarely do this in their tenure. So, you might find an executive that has done this once or twice in their life. Having somebody who's done it multiple times is an extraordinary rarity. Yeah. And so when executives come to having to make the decision to replace their business system, they don't go out and look for the lessons learned. And, the software vendors, there are some very, very good ones out there. And let's be brutally honest, there are some that aren't quite as ethical as some others. When they come up against those sorts of people without experience, it's very difficult. I often say it's like sending your 14-year-old daughter down to the used car salesman with an open check and have a look at what she comes home with.
Nice analogy. So, David, I'd like to dive a little bit into the culture piece of this. And I know in your book, you certainly you touch on culture. And then previously, when I asked you about what are some of the most critical aspects of ERP project management, you discussed the importance of culture. But you also state on your website, just to share with the listeners really quick, you share that, quote, ERP is more about people and outcomes than it is about technology. So I know, David, this is a loaded question, but what role does the overall corporate culture play in ERP organizational change and why? Can maybe just kind of peel that onion back a little bit more for us?
Sure, no problem. I think as I outlined before, I think it's critical. It's everything. Irrespective of the capability of the client's people or the software vendors team that they bring on the project for you, if the right culture is not in place, then there's a significantly higher risk that it's going to go off the rails. And you'll end up with each side blaming each other for the failure or things going wrong. And in its extreme, I think we've all seen, litigation. So, for example, internal politics within an organisation plays a huge role, as is that open communication piece that I mentioned before and the culture of accountability. If those things aren't there and you're working in a highly political environment, that just makes the job of deploying this piece of technology so much more difficult.
Absolutely. I think with the organizational culture, and to me, there's a direct link. Science and research proves this, but there's a direct link between positive organizational culture and organizational performance. For instance, one of the tools that we like to use is the Denison model and the Denison survey.
Yep.
And that helps to measure an organization's adaptability, mission, consistency, and involvement. And then those 4 pieces are further broken down into 12 other attributes,
Sure.
which includes organizational learning, which is critical, which I want to ask you about here in a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Vision, goals and objectives, team orientation. And so those often abstract attributes of an organization, which are often harder to see and to measure, have a significant impact, to your point, on successful organizational change. No doubt about it.
Well, I sorry for interrupting there, Jack, but I find that the capability of the software vendors team is critical in that space, in that it's really important that the people that they bring to the table don't always, not only do they have to understand the application deeply and be able to apply that knowledge around the application to the business that they're deploying this in, and an ability to learn what that business is about and what the nuances in that business is. While that's important, I think the most important piece is their ability to be able to build a strong relationship. And I have a very strong focus on relationship in the selection processes that I run. Yes, the business requirements and the functional fit of the software is important, but I think that ability around a cultural alignment and relationship between the software vendor and the potential client is as important.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. David, what do you think? What challenges do you most often face as you implement ERP? And I know every organizational change or ERP implementation is different, right? Every organizational context, that is.
Yeah.
So it's hard to, have the same answer across the board or the same issues. I think that there's the same number of variables with every implementation, but the magnitude of any given variable can vary drastically from one organization to another. But would you say, is there any 1 or 2 challenges that you most often face when you implement ERP?
The answer to that is yes. And the 2 I've got really are, there is only one fastest and most economical way to successfully implement an ERP system, and that is to have the very best people in your company working in a full-time capacity and dedicated to the project. And I am often in a robust discussion with executives in the company saying, no, we need this particular individual or a couple of the other individuals because they are the very best. And they say, but we can't do without them. They are vital to our business. And I think the key piece that they're missing there is by extracting them out of their normal role and committing them to the project, they're doing 2 things. They are giving the project its best chance of success, and they are building succession planning and capability within their own business, because somebody has to fill that role while the best person is away at the project. And what that does is it helps build the capability at a broader footprint across the business and helps with the succession planning. So that's the first one. We need to have the best quality people on the project dedicated full-time. The minute an executive starts talking about having a part-time approach to an ERP implementation, I walk away. The second piece is the importance of having change management in the budget for the project. I find it is often the first thing that they cut from a project budget, because they say, we can adequately handle the change management aspects. And my experience would be they don't.
Interesting. David, do you think often in your experience, is it easier said than done to have the full-time team members participate? Or do you find that once you can, maybe not convince isn't the right word, but explain to organizations the value in that? Because obviously that means if you pull several people away from their day job to focus on the project, then they have to somehow backfill,
correct,
those positions.
Yes.
But I agree with the idea of high quality, dedicated people to the project for sure. What's your experience been with that in terms of making that stick? So if you get that commitment, Is that something that the organization sticks to that, or has that been a challenge?
It has always been a challenge, and it remains a challenge because what happens, of course, is no business operates smoothly. There will always be issues and problems that need to be solved. And the minute you've pulled an experienced person out of the role and pulled somebody in that's learning the role or getting their experience at that level for the first time, they are not going to be able to handle those issues as efficiently or effectively as the person who's experienced. And so there is always a draw back to business as usual for the people on the project team. But I guess I flippantly say, listen, you haven't sent these people to the moon. They can go around to the guy's office or the lady's office and help them and then come back to the project. So you don't really, as long as they are helping them as opposed to doing it for them, then the project's momentum isn't impacted all that much.
Yeah. And David, I know you assist organizations in doing ERP selections as well. And obviously this would be an idea that is well thought out in advance and planned for in advance, right? So typically if you're going through a selection and you have 2, 3, 4, 5 different vendors you're looking at, that would be the time to start talking about the internal resourcing and what that's going to look like internally.
100%.
You wait until you start the actual implementation. This is well before.
Yes. No, I plant the seeds very early and I tend to those seeds and water them and encourage that concept all the way through the selection process.
And I guess kind of a similar, what about learning and development? For me, that's something that takes a fair amount of foresight in planning, and that needs to begin well before you start your actual implementation. But what about learning and development in the organization? To what extent do you suggest and encourage opportunities for training and learning, both before implementation, during, and post?
So I've got a slightly different view on this to many in the industry. Most software vendors will talk, particularly in the selection piece and in the sales component, about training and the learning and development. They'll talk about the train-the-trainer model that they use and all those sorts of things. There's a couple of things around that. Firstly, I think the train-the-trainer model is flawed. Fundamentally, I do believe in building capability within an organization. So for all of my ERP implementation projects, even back in the selection piece, I again plant these seeds that the organization knows that this is the outcome that we're looking to get. And I think it's one of the most critical areas that impacts the long-term success of an ERP project. And I actually call it knowledge transfer as opposed to learning and development, or training and learning and development. I think it's really important that knowledge gets transferred from the people, from the consultants at the vendor into the project team from the client. So it's important for them, I believe, to build capability. It's really important that they understand the nuances of the configuration settings and the interdependencies. So I talk about them understanding how the system hangs together under the hood, because you've built that capability and they have that understanding and knowledge, they then become self-sufficient. Now, some vendors are short-term thinking, small-minded about that because they see a revenue source being withdrawn from them because they're not getting support fees and those sorts of things when they need help. But I think the business is far better off in the long term when they've built that capability. And actually the software vendor, I think, is better off because they then have a completely different discussion with their client. They can start talking about other aspects of the business, the phase 2s and 3s and 4s and that continual improvement process that goes on within a business, or at least should go on within a business, about leveraging the capability that is inherent in a lot of these systems, but isn't always deployed at the beginning because, let's be frank, you have to be careful how big of an elephant you eat first time up.
Yeah, exactly. And David, this is a topic that you and I know, could discuss for an hour and dig into quite a bit. But I do agree with you. I think that the train-the-trainer model is flawed. I would agree with that. And I think in very, very, very rare cases may that be a way to go. But I think for the most part, it is flawed. I think often it's seen as a way to reduce time and money and effort and cost from a project planning perspective, but I think it's flawed. And there is a field called L&D, obviously, learning and development, which I think, as you do, David, I think of it as effective in learning transfer of knowledge, basically is what it is. And, and I also think that we in the ERP field, and not just practitioners, but as vendors, we have an awful lot to learn from the L&D folks. And we've had several podcasts, and we will continue to have several podcasts where we invite learning and development professionals to join us and share their insight, because I do think that that idea, as you say, of effective knowledge transfer is absolutely critical. And, and there's a way when you look at ERP vendor project plans tactically to see how they address and how important knowledge transfer and learning and development is. So just by looking at the actual project plan, you can see, frankly, what they know or don't know about effective knowledge transfer.
I would agree. And to add to that, I would say that I tell my clients that repetition is the mother of learning. And it's really important for the client's team to have their hands on the keyboards as early as possible. Another saying I say, particularly to the vendors I work with, I said, if the consultant's hands are on the keyboard, there's no learning going on.
Yeah.
Now, the organization is not learning anything unless the client's team have their hands on the keyboard.
Yeah, definitely a topic we could talk about for an hour, but absolutely agree with that. David, you wrote an article on your blog titled Benefits of Conflict, and that link will be in our show notes. I thought that was a good article, and it raised a valuable point. But when you go through an ERP organizational change process, are there really even conflicts, or is it more typical that everything is good?
If there's not some robust disagreement occurring in conversations, in workshops, or those sorts of things, I get concerned, because I think that's a sign that people aren't necessarily thinking this through properly. One of the skills that the client's team has to have is to question things. And likewise, the software vendors, consultants need to be constantly questioning. And if both sides of the parties are doing that, that by its very nature is going to generate some areas where robust discussion or conflict is needed. Now, clearly conflict needs to be well handled. It can't be an all-out brawl. However, I think it's really important that those robust conversations take place. And my experience has been where those robust conversations are occurring, we get the best outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely there's benefits of conflict. And I agree. I think that those organizations, especially where they have a positive organizational culture, where they allow risk and failure and some conflict and challenging each other and open dialogue, it is a very productive exercise. And I will admit, especially early on in my career, after you come out of a session or a meeting, it's kind of like the expectation was, well, no conflicts, solve the issues, just make sure everyone's happy. But that's not the way it works. And I think, to your point, the most productive conflicts are the ones where you are talking, where you are engaging, where you have bidirectional conversation. And just by the nature of the fact that we're all humans, there's going to be conflict. And the way you kind of get through that and make that to the benefit of the organization is to, figure out how to work through it as a team. And I think that's absolutely critical.
And the other thing there too, Jack, is that 9 times out of 10, the time that it takes to have those conversations and to talk things through at the detailed level that needs to be done to get the right outcome, none of that appears in a project plan timeline.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of those things that are often not even considered in any project plan tactically or even abstractly. People don't even think about that. And
no, they don't.
And there is such a thing too as productive and positive politics, kind of going along the lines of benefits of conflict. When you're in an organization and every stakeholder group, every individual, every department has various motivations, they have various skill levels, experiences. There's organizational influences that we've talked about a little bit. There's just so many ways that people can have different interests in the project, and that just is bound to create some conflict. And
100%.
But yeah, positive politics is good as long as it's positive, because there is such a thing. And back to your point, I think it's all in not trying to dismiss it and not allow conflict or politics, but to allow it, but to manage it in a way and channel it in a way that it's productive.
Yeah, I think it's really important to call it out for what it is. You need to understand what the political landscape is in an organization. Now, let's be brutally honest. Every organization has a political environment of some sort or another. And it's not whether it's good or bad. It's about making sure that you fully understand what the landscape is so that you can do what it takes to navigate that properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And again, I think, another thing is this idea of being very transparent about the realities and the expectations of especially a large scale ERP organizational change effort. And a lot of times that is also something that you can do things about by tactically including, various exercises and conversations in your project plan. And I think that's a really important part of success as well, is just being very honest and realistic.
I agree, because each organisation, if they're multi-site, for example, within the one country, each of those sites will have their own nuances around the politics, and then you've got global rollouts and so forth. You've got the cultural and the other political pieces that go together, not only on a site but in another country. So this can be quite an impactful thing, and if it's not thought through properly and understood properly, it can have a major impact on the success of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. So, David, I would like to circle back to the idea of ERP selection and the value of ERP selection. And I just want to share some articles here with our listeners, and then these will all be in the show notes as well. But you have some articles, for example, called 11 Steps to Conducting an Effective ERP Vendor Due Diligence. Another one, David, is selecting the right software vendor and partner. And another one is software demonstrations, where you share that language is important, right? Language that you use during the demonstration is very important. And lastly, David, you share on your website that, quote, there is usually no shortage of biased information out there. True independence pays, end quote. What would you tell our listeners about the value of ERP selection? And can you share some additional pointers?
Certainly. I think it's really important to understand what it is you want. So a lot of my time in the ERP selection piece is around making sure that there is an alignment between the executives and the shop floor. As I mentioned earlier in our chat, often there are significant differences around expectations of executives and those people who actually do the work. So in my selection team makeup, I want to get a good cross-section of people from the various parts of the business, so we understand what it is that we really want and what business outcomes we're looking to get. I mentioned before about the importance of relationship, it being as important as the functional fit. That's pretty much the thrust of the selecting the right software partner vendor article that I wrote. The demonstrations piece, it's really about making sure that there's about 2 or 3 really key pieces. And one of them is that you actually see the product working with your data, doing your work. There's a number of vendors out there that will do a PowerPoint slide demonstration, and they'll put up a screenshot and they say, when you click here, it does this, it does this, it does this. Well, I'm sorry if I warn all the vendors up front when I'm running a selection and the demonstration, if you do that, you're out.
Yeah.
Because, and it might seem a bit harsh, but the reality is the client has to get confidence that the vendor or the people presenting the product actually understand their business and can demonstrate how the software is going to improve that business. Because if there's no business improvement, then why do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Key point. It's not just about the vendor showing off their knowledge on their own product. They need to display their knowledge of your business.
Yes,
right?
and it's unfair in some respects because they are an outsider and, they are looking in from the outside and they don't understand the nuances of your specific business. However, what they can do is ask really good, smart questions so that it comes out and then get them to respond in the moment. Now, to that end, in the demonstrations, while we give them a script and business outcomes that we're looking to get them to show, I will hold back a number of questions in the hope that they will flush out their ability to think on their feet and use the knowledge that they have about the product to a particular business scenario in the moment. Now, that's one of the things that we score in my selection process. So I have a number of gates that we actually do scoring to try and provide some qualitative feel around gut feel, if that makes sense. So I'll withhold those questions and just use them in the moment to highlight, and we can then compare how each of the consultants and each of the parties deal with that particular scenario.
Yeah, you raised a great point, David. I think it's important for our listeners to understand that during a selection process, it really isn't good enough to have them come in with a PowerPoint deck and give you some screenshots and just say, this is how it works. At some level, being able to provide them some data in advance and having them actually walk through and show you in your business scenario, give you some general idea of what it looks like with your own data, I think is a very valuable exercise.
Now, the thing that clients need to remember is that this actually is quite an investment on the software vendor's behalf. So there are times when I don't think clients give the vendors enough credit for the effort that they've gone to do this, and I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, agreed. I often tell people that that's the cost of doing business. And if they want your business, let's go ahead and let them earn it. But that is so true. We have great relationships with ERP vendors, and there's no doubt that a lot of times they spend a lot of time on the front end trying to earn business, going through that exercise. So that's absolutely true, that it does take time to prepare a demo with live data. David, you also have some blog articles titled 3 Traits of Successful Leaders and The Power of Politics. Those were 2 of articles that you wrote that I appreciated. What leadership styles or attributes would you say were most prevalent during the best of your ERP implementation experiences? So if you were to just kind of reflect back throughout your career, and I know you have many years of great experiences and successes, but if you just kind of reflect upon the ones that they were the most effective and efficient with their whole process, they were successful in the end. Any common denominators there from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, there's a number of that. I won't go into whether they're an aggressive leadership style or a conciliatory style or that sort of thing, because there's a broad range of those sorts of traits amongst the successful projects. But if we look, I think one of the key traits is that they have the ability to hold their people accountable. So they make sure that the outcome and expectations are well understood and are held to those expectations. There's been a number of, I'll almost say every implementation, but that's not 100% right. It's probably 93 or 94% of situations where we've come across a roadblock. Somebody in particular is preventing the project from progressing properly, or they're being kind of the spanner in the wheel, in the cogs, if that makes sense. And the successful projects are ones where the leaders have identified that, understood what was going on, and took steps. And in most cases, that was termination. So I've hardly done a project where somebody who had the wrong attitude didn't get terminated. Those projects where that didn't occur, we didn't get the successful outcome. So the ability to understand what's going on and be accountable and hold their people accountable is probably one of the most important traits of a leader in these sorts of projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So David, what value do you put in change management, and how do you tactically manage that?
Absolutely. Change management, in my view, is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, change management is often one of the first items withdrawn from a project budget. But I think the ability to manage the shift in business outcome is absolutely important. I think there's a lot more to change management than just communication and keeping people informed and those sorts of things. While they're important, it's really that mind shift that's needed to make these things successful. And that's where the difference between a good change manager and an average change manager really stands out. It's about understanding human behavior, motivation, those sorts of things, and putting things in place to make that happen.
Well said. Can you give us one example of when you say putting things in place to make that happen? Just maybe give our listeners one tactical example on what that looks like.
One of the best change managers I've ever worked with was doing something similar to what I mentioned before about the software vendors. It's about the relationship and building the relationship with them. So they were always going around the team, talking to the vendors, talking to the client's team members, and understanding where they were emotionally around the project. Because let's be honest, emotion makes us act. And the good change managers understand the emotional temperature of the team and individuals within that team. And it could be something as simple as giving them a pat on the back at the right moment, or just checking in at the right time around the right topics. It can be as subtle as that, but it has a massive impact on the way the project actually runs.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that emotional temperature. I think that's critical. And a lot of times, in my view, I think some of the most successful leaders, especially of large-scale ERP organizational change, they display empathy, right? They understand, they want to hear, they want to listen. And I think that goes a long way.
Because there's lots of tools and techniques, but I don't think it's the tools and techniques that actually make the difference.
Yeah, right. Yeah, back to your, maybe that's more of a culture thing, right? Leadership and what that looks like within the organization. That's certainly something that's a bit, maybe sometimes a bit abstract and hard to make it super tactical, but it is a very important idea. Okay, David, so you wrote your book, and I recommend this to our listeners. And again, that's called the 14 Deadly Sins of ERP Implementation. But to put you on the spot, David, choose just two. If you had to choose two, what would you say are the most critical success factors that facilitated your success throughout your career?
I think it's my experience in that I have been an owner and manager. Lots of my competitors have come through the consulting firms and those sorts of things and have never actually had to make payroll. They've never actually had to rob Peter to pay Paul to pay the bills. They haven't actually been a business owner. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the conversations that I had with my mum and dad around the kitchen table about the business and those sorts of things have given me a very strong understanding of what it is to be a business owner. And so you mentioned empathy before. In change management, I think I've got that with my buyers. So the people that I work with are either business owners or CEOs, and they are charged with that, and I've had to do that. I think that's the first one. And the second one, as you've probably picked up, my style is I'm very open, transparent, and honest. My advice is often called blunt, but I think those that understand what it is I bring to the table appreciate that openness and that frank advice. I don't pull any punches. I say things as I find them, and I think that makes me stand out from the rest.
Excellent. And David, before I let you go today, I'm going to ask you our last question. If you're going to give advice to an organization preparing for an ERP implementation, what golden little nugget would you leave our listeners with today?
This might sound self-serving, and it isn't meant to be, but at least get some advice from somebody who is independent. There is very little genuine independence out there, and I think that's really, really important, even if it's just to confirm that you're doing the right things.
David, I couldn't agree more on that point. I do want to add to that because I know that you do a lot of ERP selections, as does Nestell Associates. And I think it's a disservice to clients if you're not independent, right? If you don't approach the selection process with a very unbiased and from an independent lens.
Yes.
And when there's organizations that have relationships with any ERP vendor, whether they're a value-added reseller or an implementation partner, and they're guiding you through your selection process, it seems to me to be a bit of a disservice, and I never quite understood that. So I think that's part of your message as well.
100%. Yeah. There is 100% of my income comes from clients. There is nothing else, no considerations, nothing coming from any of the vendors. Now, having said that, I do have relationships with all of the software vendors that are in the market, but I'm guessing that's what clients would expect somebody in my role would have.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have great friends and relationships with many ERP vendors and ERP professionals, that are associated with specific platforms. We work with them every single day, but that doesn't change the fact that being a independent and what we call vendor neutral, in my view, is quite important.
100%. I agree completely.
David, thank you so much for your time today. I do appreciate it. I appreciate your work. I appreciate your practice. I really appreciate your book, and I really appreciate your time. Can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, David?
I guess my website, which is davidogilvie.com.au. Ogilvie is spelt Ogilv for victory, IE. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I am on Twitter as in Pathway to Profit, using the number 2, and my email is david@davidogilvie.com.au.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you very much. Be well, and we will be in touch soon.
Jack, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting NestellAssociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #TheERPocj. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.